Hello, dear listeners. Welcome once again to Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy tales that linger in the quiet corners of memory, if you've ever felt a whisper in the static, then you're in the right place. Please, if this story touches something deep inside you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a gentle comment below. Your support helps these nighttime whispers find their way to others who listen just as closely as you do. Now, let us step into the hush of an autumn evening, where the veil between worlds grows thin, and the static calls a name. It was the first week of October, in the year 2017. The air in Blackwater, Vermont carried a crispness that clung to the skin like old secrets. Maple leaves, stained rust and amber, swirled through Main Street in slow, silent eddies, as if reluctant to settle. Electricity flickered that week, not from storms, mind you, but from something older, something that hummed beneath the town's quiet surface like a forgotten radio frequency. At the edge of town, nestled between the whispering pines and the crumbling remains of the old granite quarry, stood the Holloway farmhouse. It had belonged to Alara Vasa's great-grandmother, then her grandmother, and now to her. She'd returned just 3 months prior, after more than a decade away, first for college in Chicago, then for a job in Seattle that had quietly unraveled beneath the weight of exhaustion. Alara hadn't planned on coming back, but the house had called her. Not with words, never with words, but with silence so deep it became a kind of sound. Alara was not a woman given to superstition. Her hair, the color of storm clouds, was always pulled back in a practical twist. Her eyes, gray as river stones, saw things clearly, so she thought. But clarity began to fray on that particular evening. The evening the static started speaking. She'd been washing dishes when it began, standing at the kitchen sink, warm water pooling around her wrists, the scent of lavender soap curling into the air. Outside, dusk settled like a heavy quilt over the hills. Then from the living room, a low hiss. The old television, unplugged for weeks, glowed faintly. Not with a picture, but with snow. A soft, rolling static that seemed to breathe. Alara turned off the faucet. Water dripped into the sink, each drop echoing too loudly. She walked slowly into the living room, bare feet pressing into the worn braided rug. The screen pulsed faintly, then just once, a voice slipped through the noise. Alara. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was soft, intimate, as though someone had leaned close and whispered directly into her ear. Her breath hitched. She reached for the television, fingers trembling, but the moment she touched the wooden console, the screen went black. Silence returned, but it felt different now. Watchful. She told herself it was a glitch. Maybe a neighbor's radio interfering. Maybe the old wiring in the house finally giving up. But that night, as she lay in the narrow bed beneath the eaves, the static returned. This time it didn't come from the television. It came from the cordless phone on the nightstand, the one she never used. The speaker crackled, then sighed, and again her name. Alara. She sat up, heart thudding like a trapped bird. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. Frost feathered the inside of the window pane, though the thermostat read 68. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the phone. It was dead. She hadn't charged it in months. The next morning, Alara drove into Blackwater to buy new batteries, anything to prove to herself that there was a rational explanation. At the general store, Mrs. Crenshaw, who'd run the place since the Eisenhower administration, peered over her wire-rimmed glasses. "You look pale, child," she said, handing over a pack of AA batteries. "You sleepin' all right out there at the Holloway place?" Alara hesitated. "Fine, mostly." Mrs. Crenshaw's eyes narrowed slightly. "That house has years, you know, and memories longer than most folks realize." She leaned forward, voice lowering. "Your great-aunt Maribel, she used to say the radio talked to her before she passed. Said it called her name right before the stroke took her." Alara's stomach tightened. She'd never heard that story. She thanked Mrs. Crenshaw and hurried out, the autumn sun doing little to warm her. That evening the static grew louder. It seeped from the walls, from the refrigerator, from the empty hallway. Always the same, Alara, drawn out like a sigh, layered beneath white noise and something that sounded almost like weeping. Desperate, she unplugged everything. Every lamp, every appliance. She even pulled the circuit breaker. Still, the voice came, fainter now but clearer. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the land. On the third night she followed it. Wrapped in a wool coat that smelled of cedar and mothballs, Ilara stepped out into the moonless dark. The static pulled at her like a current, leading her past the overgrown garden, past the rusted swing set where she'd played as a child, and down the narrow path toward the quarry. The air grew colder with every step. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked even the starlight. At the edge of the quarry, where the granite walls dropped sharply into blackness, the static swelled into a chorus. Not just her name now, but fragments of sentences, half-formed pleas, overlapping in a mournful symphony. Come back. You left us. Ilara. Then, cutting through the noise like a blade, her mother's voice. Not as she remembered it in life, soft and warm, but strained, distant. You were supposed to stay. Ilara stumbled back, tears blurring her vision. Her mother had died when she was 11, car accident on Route 7, just outside Middlebury. She'd been the one who found the note tucked in her mother's coat pocket weeks later. If I don't come back, don't let the house forget you. She'd never understood it. Until now. The Holloway house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by absence. By the silence left behind when those who loved it walked away. And it had waited, patiently, for Ilara to return. She sank to her knees at the quarry's edge, the static now a gentle hum like a lullaby. I'm here, she whispered. I'm not leaving again. The static softened, then slowly faded. The next morning the house was quiet. Not unnaturally so, but peacefully so. The furnace kicked on without sputtering. The lights glowed steady and warm. And when Ilara turned on the radio in the kitchen, just for company, it played an old folk song her grandmother used to sing. Years later, townsfolk would say that Ilara Voss never left Blackwater again. That she tended the gardens, restored the porch swing, and sometimes sat on the steps in the evenings, listening to the wind, or perhaps to something just beneath it. And if you ever drive through Blackwater on a still autumn night, and your radio suddenly fills with static, listen closely. You might just hear a name, called not in fear, but in longing. In the months that followed, Ilara Voss settled into a rhythm the Holloway farmhouse seemed to have been waiting for all along. Mornings began with the soft clink of ceramic mugs and the scent of dark roast coffee brewed in the same chipped percolator her grandmother had used since the 1950s. She repaired the sagging porch steps, repainted the kitchen cabinets in a muted sage green, and planted heirloom tulip bulbs along the stone path where wild violets once tangled with crabgrass. Life moved slower now, deliberately so, as if time itself had exhaled and decided to stay a while. Yet the static never truly left. It simply changed its tone. No longer a voice of distress, it became a presence, subtle, almost affectionate. Sometimes, when Ilara sat by the fireplace with a book open on her lap and the wind whistling through the pines, the old transistor radio on the mantel would flicker to life on its own. Not with words, but with music. A crackling rendition of You Are My Sunshine, on a winter evening. A haunting fiddle tune from the 1930s on a rainy afternoon. The songs always matched the mood of the day, as though the house remembered what comfort sounded like. Neighbors noticed the change in her, and in the house. Lights stayed on past dusk. Smoke curled reliably from the chimney. Once, old Mr. Ellery, who ran the post office and delivered mail on foot during snowstorms, paused on her porch with a package and said, "Place feels awake again." Ilara only smiled and offered him a jar of blackberry jam she'd made from berries gathered near the creek. But the quarry remained a boundary she respected. She never returned to its edge after that night. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some thresholds, once crossed, alter you in ways you can't undo. And some voices, once heard, settle inside you like roots. Then came the spring of 2019. It began with the basement. Ilara had always avoided it. Damp, cold, and lined with shelves of mason jars filled with preserves no one had touched in decades, it smelled of mildew and old paper. But when the sump pump failed during a late April storm, She had no choice but to descend. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy-duty extension cord, she pushed open the creaking door at the foot of the back stairs and stepped into the gloom. The beam of her flashlight swept across cobwebbed corners and rusted tools. Then it landed on something new, an old wooden crate tucked beneath the stairs, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine gone brittle with age. Her fingers trembled as she untied it. Inside lay a stack of vinyl records, yellowed envelopes, and a leather-bound journal with her mother's name embossed in faded gold, Lillian Holloway. Elara sank onto an overturned bucket, heart pounding. She'd never known her mother kept a journal. She took it upstairs, brewed a pot of chamomile tea, and opened it beneath the soft glow of the reading lamp. The handwriting was quick, looping, sometimes smudged, as if written in haste or emotion. April 3rd, 1998. The static started again tonight. Not from the radio this time, from the telephone. It said, "She's coming." I don't know who she is, but the house feels expectant, like it's waiting for someone to return. Maybe it's just grief playing tricks. But what if it's not? What if this place remembers more than we do? Elara turned the page, breath shallow. June 17, 1999. Elara asked me today why the walls hum when it rains. I told her it's the pipes. But I lied. It's not the pipes. It's the same hum I heard as a child. Graham used to say the house breathes through the wires. That those who leave too soon leave echoes behind. I don't want to leave echoes. I want to stay. For her. Tears blurred the ink. Elara wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater and kept reading. October 21st, 2000. If something happens to me, tell Elara the house chose her. Not the other way around. It's been waiting for her voice. For her footsteps. For her to remember what we all forgot. That homes have hearts too. Elara closed the journal and held it to her chest. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the roof like a lullaby. And from the kitchen, faint but unmistakable, the refrigerator emitted a low, rhythmic static. Not a voice this time, but a pulse. A heartbeat. That summer she began recording sounds. Not professionally, just with her phone placed on the windowsill at dawn, or propped on the back porch at midnight. She captured the creak of floorboards, the wind in the eaves, the distant chime of the old bell above the garden gate. And always beneath it all, the hum. A constant, gentle frequency that seemed to rise and fall with her mood. When she laughed, it brightened. When she wept, it deepened into a mournful drone. She never shared the recordings. Not with anyone. But she listened to them often, late at night, headphones cradling her ears like a secret. Then, one evening in early September, a stranger appeared. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of dried clay. He stood at the edge of her driveway, hands in the pockets of a worn denim jacket, staring at the house as if it owed him an answer. Elara watched from the kitchen window, uneasy but not afraid. There was something familiar in the set of his shoulders, in the way he tilted his head as though listening. She stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" He turned. "You're Elara Voss?" "I am. My name's Theron Pike. My grandfather built this house." He paused. "Well, help build it. Back in 1923. Elara blinked. "The Pikes? You're from over near Lake Champlain?" He nodded. "Used to visit as a boy. My ma called this place the Listening House. Said it soaked up voices like a sponge." He glanced toward the roof, where the satellite dish stood crooked beside the chimney. "Still talking to you?" Elara hesitated. Then, slowly, "It listens more than it talks." Theron smiled, a quiet, knowing thing. "Mind if I sit a spell?" She brought out 2 chairs and a pot of iced tea. As dusk fell, he told her stories she'd never heard, of how the original wiring had been strung with copper salvaged from a decommissioned telegraph line, of how her great-grandfather had buried a quartz crystal beneath the front step to anchor the spirit, of how, during the war, the women of the house would leave the radio on all night, tuned to static, so the men overseas wouldn't feel alone. "Static's not empty," he said, swirling the ice in his glass. "It's full of everything that ever was. You just gotta know how to listen." Before he left, He handed her a small wooden box. Inside lay a tuning fork tarnished with age. "Strike it near a speaker," he said. "You'll hear what the house wants you to know." That night Elara did. She placed her phone on the coffee table, opened a voice memo app, and struck the fork against the edge of the fireplace. A clear, high tone rang out, and instantly the static flared. But this time it wasn't noise. It was music. A woman's voice, clear as morning light, singing an old lullaby in French, her grandmother's voice. Then another, her mother's, laughing softly. Then her own childhood voice, small and bright. "Mama, the radio's singing again." Elara wept until her ribs ached. From that day on she stopped fearing the static. She began speaking to it, sharing her days, her worries, her quiet joys. And the house responded in its own language. Warm drafts in cold rooms, lights that flickered in greeting, the occasional scent of lavender soap in an empty hallway. Years passed. Seasons turned. And the Holloway farmhouse, once a monument to absence, became a sanctuary of memory, alive, listening, loving. And if you ever pass through Blackwater, Vermont, and your car radio suddenly fills with gentle static on a clear night, don't change the station. Just listen. You might hear a name, called not in warning, but in welcome. As the years settled like dust motes in sunlit rooms, Elara Voss became less a woman living in a house and more a thread woven into its fabric. The townspeople of Blackwater no longer spoke of the Holloway place as haunted, but as tended, cared for, remembered. Children on bicycles would slow as they passed the white picket fence, not out of fear but curiosity, drawn by the scent of wood smoke and rosemary, or the sound of wind chimes made from old silver spoons that tinkled even on still afternoons. Elara began hosting small gatherings. Nothing grand, just neighbors sharing soup on winter evenings or helping shell peas on the back porch in late summer. She never mentioned the static aloud, but those who stayed past midnight sometimes noticed how the old wall clock ticked in time with the hum of the refrigerator, or how the lights dimmed gently when someone spoke of someone gone. Then, in the autumn of 2023, the letters arrived. Not by post, but in the hollow of the old sugar maple at the edge of the property. Tucked inside a rusted tin box lined with faded velvet, they were tied with a ribbon the color of dried blood. Elara recognized the handwriting instantly, her mother's. But these letters bore no postmarks, no dates, only numbers. 1 through 7. She read the first that same night, seated by the fire, the wind howling like a chorus of distant voices. Asterisk, my dearest Elara, if you're reading this, you've come back. And the house has let you see. These words were never meant to be sent. They were meant to be found, when the time was right. The static, it isn't just memory. It's a bridge. And someone is trying to cross it. Asterisk. Elara's breath caught. She turned the page with trembling fingers. Asterisk, you think it's us calling you. But sometimes, it's you calling us. The grief, the longing, it echoes backward through time. The house catches those echoes and plays them back like songs on a loop. But echoes can be answered. Be careful what you wish for in the silence. Asterisk. The next morning, fog clung to the ground like a second skin. Elara walked to the maple tree and found the second letter already waiting in the same tin, though she hadn't returned it the night before. This one was heavier, sealed with wax imprinted with a symbol she didn't recognize, a spiral inside a circle. Inside, the writing was different, not her mother's hand but her grandmother's, sharp and precise. Asterisk, child, you've awakened the conduit. The wiring in these walls wasn't just for electricity. It was laid to carry more than current. Your great-grandfather knew. He worked with Tesla's men for a season in New Jersey before coming north. They believed structures could store emotional resonance, if built with the right materials, the right intent. This house was built to remember. And to respond. Asterisk. Elara sat on the damp grass, the letter cradled in her lap. Tesla? Emotional resonance? It sounded like madness, except everything in her bones told her it was true. That evening she descended into the basement again, this time with purpose. Armed with a pry bar and a headlamp, she pried open the panel behind the furnace. Beneath layers of insulation and decades of dust, she found it. A network of copper wires, thicker than modern ones, wrapped in cloth and woven into geometric patterns along the joists. At the center, soldered into the main junction, was a small quartz crystal, exactly as Theron Pike had described, and humming. Not audibly, but vibrationally. She placed her palm flat against the wooden beam and felt it. A low, steady thrum like the pulse of something sleeping or dreaming. Over the next weeks, Ilara documented everything. She photographed the wiring, sketched the symbols etched into the floor joists, ancient sigils mixed with electrical diagrams that made no sense to modern engineers but sang of intention. She wrote to Theron Pike, who replied within days with a package of old blueprints and a note. Asterisk, they called it a sympathetic circuit. Not for power, for presence. Asterisk. But the true test came on the night of the winter solstice. The house grew quiet, unusually so. No hum, no static. Just the creak of wood and the whisper of snow against the windows. Ilara sat in the parlor, the 7 letters spread before her on the coffee table. She had read them so many times the paper was soft at the edges. Then, at precisely 10 minutes past midnight, the radio on the shelf clicked on. No static. No music. Just silence, deep and expectant. And then a voice. Not her mother's. Not her grandmother's. Ilara. It was her own voice, but younger. 10 years old. The day her mother left for the last time. Asterisk. Mama, will you be back before dark? Asterisk. Another voice, her mother's, faint but clear. Asterisk. Always my love. Asterisk. Ilara stood, tears streaming down her face. The radio wasn't playing a recording. It was pulling a moment from the air, the emotional residue of that morning, preserved in the walls like amber. She walked to the front door and opened it. The snow-covered yard glowed under a full moon. And there, near the gate, stood a figure, not solid, not ghostly, but shimmering like heat off pavement. A woman in a red coat. Her mother. Ilara didn't run. She stepped forward slowly, barefoot in the snow. I never said goodbye, she whispered. The figure turned. Not with eyes, but with presence. And in that instant the static returned, not as noise but as warmth. It wrapped around Ilara like an embrace. Then the figure faded. The radio clicked off. The next morning, Ilara found a single red mitten on the porch. Her childhood mitten, lost the day of the funeral, now dry and clean as if just taken off. She kept it on the mantel beside the tuning fork. Word spread quietly after that. Not as gossip but as reverence. The Holloway house wasn't haunted by the dead. It was tended by the living who remembered them well. People began leaving small tokens at the gate. A smooth stone, a pressed flower, a child's drawing of a house with a heart-shaped window. Ilara collected them in a glass jar by the door. She called it the Jar of Echoes. In the spring of 2025, she started a project no one expected, restoring the old broadcast tower on the ridge behind the property. It had been abandoned since the 1950s, a skeletal antenna rusting against the sky. With help from a retired ham radio operator and 2 college students studying historical acoustics, she rebuilt the transmitter, not to send signals outward but to listen inward. They called it Project Lumen. Using modified receivers and resonant coils, they discovered that the entire valley carried a low-frequency hum, the collective emotional signature of generations. Joy, sorrow, births, farewells, all woven into the Earth's magnetic field, amplified by the granite bedrock and the copper veins beneath Blackwater. The Holloway house sat at the convergence point. And Ilara? She became its keeper. Not a ghost hunter. Not a medium. Just a listener. On quiet nights, she still hears her name in the static. But now she answers. Here, she says. I'm here. And the house breathes. And the wires hum. And the past walks softly through the present, not to haunt, but to heal. If you've ever felt a presence in an empty room, if you've heard your name in the silence between stations, know this, you are not alone. Memory lingers where love was strong. And sometimes, the most haunted places are the ones that never stopped loving us back. By the summer of 2026, the Holloway farmhouse had become something quietly legendary, not in the way of ghost tours or viral videos, but in the hushed reverence of those who understood that some places hold more than walls and windows. They hold thresholds. And Alara Voss, once a weary woman fleeing a life that had frayed at the edges, now stood as its gentle guardian. Tourists didn't come. There were no signs, no ticket booths, no flashing lights. But people found their way nonetheless, drawn by word of mouth, by dreams, or by the strange way their car radios behaved when passing through Blackwater after dusk. Some simply parked at the end of the lane, sat in silence for a while, and left a stone on the low stone wall by the road. Others wrote letters and slipped them into the hollow of the sugar maple. Alara read every one. She never replied, but she kept them in a cedar chest beneath her bed, tied in bundles with twine, like seeds waiting for the right season. Then came the storm. Not the kind with thunder and lightning, though those came too, but the kind that stirs the unseen. It began on a still July night, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and wet earth. The static returned differently this time, not as a whisper but as a chorus. Layered, urgent. Dozens of voices overlapping, none distinct, yet all familiar. The lights flickered in patterns, 3 quick pulses, then a pause, then 2 long, like Morse code from another century. Alara knew. Something was trying to get through. She went to the basement, where the copper-laced walls seemed to vibrate beneath her fingertips. The quartz crystal at the heart of the sympathetic circuit glowed faintly, not with light, but with a warmth that seeped into her palm. She struck the tuning fork and held it against the main conduit. The hum deepened, resonated through the floorboards, up her spine into her skull. And then silence. Complete. Absolute. Even the crickets stopped. In that void, a single voice emerged, clear, calm, and ancient. Alara Voss. It wasn't her mother. Not her grandmother. This voice carried the weight of generations, the timbre of roots and bedrock. You have listened well. Now you must choose. She swallowed. Choose what? To keep the bridge closed, or open it? She understood immediately. The house had been a receiver, a vessel for echoes. But it could become a doorway. Not for spirits in the ghostly sense, but for moments. For unresolved farewells. For love that never found its final expression. Will it hurt? She asked. Only if you forget you are still alive. She thought of all the letters in the cedar chest. Of the red mitten on the mantel. Of the child who had lost her mother too soon and spent years running from silence. She thought of the woman she had become, grounded, listening, no longer afraid of the dark because she'd learned the dark sings too. I choose to open it, she said. The moment the words left her lips, the static surged, not as noise but as energy. The lights blazed white, then settled into a soft golden glow. Every clock in the house struck midnight, though it was barely 9. Outside the wind stilled. The stars seemed to lean closer. Then they came. Not as apparitions but as presences. A woman humming while kneading dough in the kitchen, her great-grandmother Agnes. A boy chasing fireflies near the well, her uncle lost to polio in 1942. Her mother sitting on the porch swing, watching the sunset with a cup of tea steaming in her hands. They didn't speak. They simply were. Living their moments again, not trapped, but revisited, like pages turned gently in a book long shelved. Alara moved among them like a guest in her own home. She sat beside her mother on the swing. Didn't touch her, didn't need to. The warmth of her presence was enough. I'm sorry I ran, Alara whispered. Her mother turned, eyes full of tenderness. You didn't run. You grew. And you came back. That's what mattered. By dawn, the presences faded. But the house was changed. Lighter. Brighter. As if a weight had been lifted not from the structure, but from the air itself. In the weeks that followed, the static grew quieter, more musical. It no longer called her name in fear or longing, but in greeting. And sometimes, when Alara played her old field recordings back, she heard new layers. Laughter in the wind, footsteps in empty hallways, the soft clink of teacups at midnight. She began writing a book, not a memoir but a guide. Listening to the unseen, how places remember. She didn't mention ghosts or hauntings. She wrote about resonance, about copper and quartz, about grief as a frequency, and love as a signal strong enough to cross time. Publishers called it poetic science. Readers called it healing. Then in early autumn, a young woman appeared at the gate. She couldn't have been more than 20, with eyes red from crying and a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Ilara recognized the look, not of curiosity but of quiet desperation. "Are you Ilara?" the girl asked, voice trembling. "I am. My name's Cora. My grandmother, she lived in Blackwater. She used to say this house could hear your heart if you stood still long enough." She paused, tears spilling. "She passed last week. And last night, my phone played her voice. Just static at first, then her saying my name. Like she was right there." Ilara opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "The house has been waiting." That evening, as rain tapped gently on the roof, Cora sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile. Ilara placed the tuning fork beside her. "Strike it," she said. "Then listen, not with your ears. With your chest." Cora did. The static rose like mist. Then clear as spring water. "My sweet Cora, don't forget to water the lilacs." Cora sobbed, but it was a sob of release, not sorrow. From that day on, Ilara wasn't just the keeper of the house. She became a guide for others learning to listen, to their own echoes, their own bridges. Years passed. The cedar chest filled with more letters. The jar of echoes overflowed. The broadcast tower on the ridge, now lovingly maintained, transmitted nothing outward, but received everything inward. Scientists came, skeptics too. Some left baffled. Others left changed. But Ilara remained. On the first snowfall of each winter, she walks to the quarry's edge, not in fear but in peace. She speaks to the wind, to the granite, to the voices woven into the earth. And sometimes, just sometimes, the static answers not with a name, but with a song. Because in the end, that's what memory is. Not a ghost, but a melody. And every heart that dares to listen becomes part of the chorus. The seasons turned once more, and with them, the quiet legend of the Holloway farmhouse deepened like the rings inside an old oak. By the spring of 2028, Blackwater had become a place people whispered about not with fear, but with hope, like a sanctuary for those who carried unsaid goodbyes in their pockets. Ilara no longer lived alone in the truest sense. Though the house held only one heartbeat of flesh and bone, it thrummed with countless others, echoes not trapped, but tenderly held, like letters kept in a drawer for the right moment. Cora stayed, not as a guest but as an apprentice. She had a knack for tuning the sympathetic circuits, her fingers light on the copper wires as if she'd known them in another life. She helped catalog the emotional signatures they captured, each one labeled not by name but by feeling: first snow after loss, laughter in the kitchen at dawn, the last walk home. They stored them in glass jars lined with felt, arranged on shelves in the sunroom where light filtered through dust and memory alike. One afternoon in late May, as lilacs bloomed along the fence line and bees hummed in the clover, a package arrived, no return address, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside lay a small leather-bound ledger and a single dried violet. The ledger's cover bore no title, only a name: Theron Pike. Ilara opened it with reverence. Page after page contained meticulous notes, dates, frequencies, observations. He had been listening to all these years from his cabin near Lake Champlain, where he'd strung his own web of resonant wire between the pines. His final entry, dated just 3 weeks prior, read: Ilara. If you're reading this, I've crossed the bridge myself. Don't mourn. I went quietly with the radio playing static and the window open to the stars. The house chose you, but you chose to stay. That's the rarest kind of magic. Keep listening. And when your time comes, don't be afraid to answer the call. Beneath the entry, tucked into the binding, was a hand-drawn map of the Blackwater Valley, marked with symbols only those who understood the language of resonance could read. At the center, the Holloway house. Radiating outward, 7 convergence points where emotional energy pooled like water in stone basins. Is this real? Cora asked, peering over her shoulder. Ilara traced the lines with her fingertip. Real enough to follow. And so they did. Over the next months, they visited each point, guided by compass, intuition, and the subtle shifts in the static that now lived inside their phones like a second pulse. At the old train trestle where a soldier had kissed his love goodbye in 1943, the air grew warm despite the frost. At the bend in the river where a child had drowned in the summer of 1969, the water stilled and reflected not the sky, but a boy's smiling face for just 3 breaths. At each place they left a token, a smooth stone, a sprig of pine, a whispered name, and recorded what they felt. Not as data but as prayer. Back at the house, they began weaving the recordings into a single soundscape, a symphony of Blackwater's heart. They played it softly through hidden speakers buried beneath the porch and garden, so visitors might hear fragments without knowing why. A lullaby in the wind, a sigh in the rain, a laugh just beyond the trees. Then came the visitor no one expected. He arrived on foot at dusk, his coat dusted with pollen, his eyes holding the quiet depth of someone who'd walked a long road not just across land but through grief. He introduced himself as Daniel Miro, great-nephew of Lillian Holloway, Ilara's mother, through a branch of the family she never knew existed. His grandmother, Miriam, had been Lillian's half-sister, sent away as a child during the Great Depression when the family could no longer feed them all. "I found her journals," he said, sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug Ilara had made herself, rough clay glazed in soft blue. She wrote about this place every day of her life. Called it, the house that breathes. She wanted to come back, but never did. Said she didn't deserve to. Ilara looked at him, really looked, and saw the same curve of the brow, the same way of holding silence. "Your family," she said simply. That night they struck the tuning fork together. The static swirled, then parted like mist. From the radio came a woman's voice, older, weary but warm. Lillian, I'm sorry I left you to carry it all. Ilara's breath caught. It was Miriam, reaching across 60 years of silence. And then, clear as starlight, her mother's voice answered, not from the radio but from the walls themselves. You were never gone. Just quiet. Daniel wept. Not from sorrow, but from the unbearable relief of being remembered. He stayed for weeks, helping repair the attic stairs, planting heirloom beans in the garden, learning the rhythm of the house. Before he left, he gave Ilara a small wooden box. Inside, a locket with 2 faded photos, Lillian as a girl and Miriam barely older, arms around each other. "Keep it," he said. So the house knows the whole story now. Years folded into one another like pages in a well-loved book. Cora eventually moved into the cottage behind the main house, restoring it with salvaged wood and stained glass from a shuttered church. She began hosting listening circles, small gatherings where people shared stories of those they'd lost, then sat in silence, waiting for the static to shift, for a name to rise like steam from hot tea. Ilara aged gracefully, her storm gray hair now silver, her hands lined with time and tenderness. She still walked the property every morning, barefoot when the grass was dewy, boots when snow covered the earth. And every night, without fail, she spoke to the house. "Good night," she'd say, hand resting on the doorframe. And the static would answer, not with words but with a single soft tone, like a lullaby tuning itself to her breath. Then, on a clear October night in 2033, the house grew still. Not cold, not empty, but expectant. Ilara sat in her favorite chair by the window, wrapped in the same wool blanket she'd brought back from Seattle all those years ago. The fire crackled low. Outside, leaves fell like whispered secrets. Cora found her there at dawn, eyes closed, a faint smile on her lips, the tuning fork resting in her open palm. The static didn't return that day. Not because it was gone, but because it had become something else, something whole. At the funeral, held not in a church but beneath the sugar maple, a strange thing happened. As Cora spoke Ilara's name, every radio in Blackwater flickered to life for exactly 7 seconds. No static, just silence, and then faintly the sound of laughter. Yeah, right, familiar. People didn't panic. They smiled. They held hands. They listened. Cora moved into the main house that winter. She kept the fires burning, the garden tended, the jar of echoes on the windowsill. And every evening she strikes the tuning fork. Sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes the voice is Alara's, you're doing fine, my dear, asterisk. And sometimes it's not a voice at all, but a feeling, a warmth, a sense of being watched over not by ghosts, but by love that refused to dissolve. The Holloway farmhouse still stands. Its paint fades, its floors creak, its wires hum with stories older than the town itself. And if you ever find yourself in Blackwater, Vermont, on a quiet night when the wind is right, stop your car. Turn off the engine. Roll down the window. Listen. You might hear your name. Not as a warning, but as a welcome home. Decades passed, yet the Holloway farmhouse never aged in the way other houses do. Its shingles weathered, its porch sagged just slightly at one corner, and ivy crept up the north wall with patient grace. But the air inside remained steady, charged with a quiet vitality that defied explanation. By the year 2041, Cora Miro, no longer the grieving girl who'd arrived with a duffel bag and red-rimmed eyes, had become the new listener, the new anchor. She wore Alara's old apron while baking rye bread, used her grandmother's journal as a recipe book for preserves, and still struck the tuning fork every evening at dusk, just as Alara had taught her. But the world beyond Blackwater had changed. Cities grew louder, faster, brighter, yet lonelier. People spoke less and scrolled more. Grief was compressed into hashtags, memory into fleeting images. And in that dissonance, the legend of the listening house grew, not from marketing but from quiet desperation. Letters arrived from as far as Oregon and New Hampshire, from widows and veterans, from teenagers who'd lost siblings too soon. They didn't ask for ghosts. They asked for a place where silence wasn't empty. Cora began accepting a few visitors each month. Not tourists but pilgrims. She'd meet them at the gate, look into their eyes and ask one question: what name do you carry in your chest that you haven't said out loud in years? If they answered honestly, she'd open the gate. If not, she'd offer tea on the porch and send them on their way with a sprig of rosemary for remembrance. One spring afternoon, a man arrived on an electric bicycle, his helmet scuffed, his hands trembling slightly. He introduced himself as Elias Thorne, a sound engineer from Boston who'd spent his career capturing whale songs and rainforest canopies. He'd come, he said, because his daughter had died 3 years earlier, hit by a car while texting a friend, and for months afterward, his car radio would switch to static every time he passed the intersection where it happened. Then one night, the static had whispered her name, Daddy? Cora led him inside without a word. That evening, as fireflies blinked above the creek, she handed him the tuning fork. Strike it, she said. Then close your eyes. Don't listen with your ears. Listen with where it hurts. He did. The static rose like breath. Then, clear as a summer morning, I wasn't mad, Daddy. I was just late. Elias collapsed to his knees, sobbing, not from pain but from release. For the first time since her death, forgiveness flowed both ways. He stayed for 2 weeks, helping Cora install a new resonant coil in the attic, calibrated to capture higher emotional frequencies. Grief isn't just low tones, he explained one night over stew. Sometimes it's high, like a child's laughter cut short. We need to hear that too. Together they refine the system. Not to summon but to honor. Not to resurrect but to reconcile. By summer they'd begun something new, the Echo Archive. Housed in the old root cellar, now lined with acoustic panels and temperature-controlled shelving, they stored not just audio, but emotional imprints captured through modified sensors that translated resonance into light patterns, which they preserved on treated glass plates. Each plate bore a single word, goodbye. Wait, sorry. Thank you. I'm here. Visitors could request to view one, if they brought their own offering. A photograph, a letter, a lock of hair tied with thread. No one left unchanged. Then, in the autumn of 2043, the house did something unprecedented. It called someone who had never been there. Cora knew because the static changed key, shifting from its usual C minor hum to a bright, questioning E major. The lights flickered in a pattern she'd never seen. 3 long, 2 short, 1 long. Morse 4 LYDIA. She checked the guest log. No Lydia was scheduled. No one by that name had ever visited. 3 days later, A woman appeared at the road's end, tall, with copper-red hair and a satchel slung across her chest. She walked slowly as if pulled by an invisible thread. When she reached the gate, she didn't knock. She simply stood, staring at the house as if recognizing a long-lost face. Cora opened the door. "I don't know why I'm here," the woman said, voice raw. "I had a dream. Just this house, and a voice saying, 'Lydia, it's time.' My name is Lydia Voss." Cora's breath caught. Voss. Not a common name. And not one used lightly in Blackwater. "Alara's cousin?" Cora asked gently. Lydia nodded. "On her father's side. We lost touch after the funeral. I thought I'd come too late." But the house had disagreed. That night, Cora led Lydia to the parlor. She struck the tuning fork and placed it on the mantel beside Alara's locket. The static swirled, then stilled. And from the walls, Alara's voice, warm as embers, asterisk, "You were never too late, Lydia. You were just learning how to listen." Asterisk. Lydia wept. She'd spent her life building walls, career, marriages, cities, anything to outrun the guilt of not being there when Alara returned to Holloway all those years ago. But the house had waited. Not with judgment, but with open arms. She stayed for a month. Helped prune the overgrown lilacs. Repaired the chicken coop. Wrote letters to her own estranged daughter back in Portland. When she left, she took nothing, but left everything. A braid of her hair tied with blue string, a pressed maple leaf from the first tree she'd climbed as a child, and a single sentence written on handmade paper. Asterisk, "I hear you now." Asterisk. Years folded into decades. Cora's hair silvered. Children she'd never born called her Aunt Cora. The listening house became a quiet institution, not funded by grants but sustained by reciprocity. Those who received gave back, mending fences, planting bulbs, baking bread for the next visitor. Then came the storm of 2050. Not wind or rain, but silence. One morning, every radio in Blackwater went dead. Not broken, just quiet. No static. No hum. Even the wires in the Holloway walls fell still. For 3 days, the valley held its breath. On the fourth night, Cora stood in the basement, hand on the quartz crystal. It was cold. Lifeless. She whispered Alara's name. Nothing. Panic rose, then subsided. Because she remembered Alara's last lesson. Asterisk, when the bridge goes quiet, it doesn't mean it's broken. It means someone's crossing. Asterisk. She climbed the ridge at dawn. There, beneath the broadcast tower, the air shimmered. Not with ghosts, but with convergence. Dozens of voices, no longer separate, but woven into one tone, the sound of peace. The house wasn't silent because it had stopped listening. It was silent because it had finally been heard. From that day on, the static returned, but softer, rarer. No longer a call, but a caress. A sigh of contentment. Cora, now in her 60s, knew her time as keeper would one day pass. She began training a young woman named Marin, daughter of the town's librarian, granddaughter of the postmaster, who had come not seeking a voice but offering her own. "I want to learn how to listen so others don't feel alone." The cycle continued. The Holloway farmhouse never became famous. It never appeared on maps. But if you know where to look, if you're willing to be still long enough, you'll find it. And if you speak a name into the quiet, the wind might just whisper it back, not to frighten but to remind you, love echoes. Always. And in that echo we are never truly gone. By the year 2058, the Holloway farmhouse stood not as a relic of the past, but as a living archive of human presence. A quiet testament to the idea that love, once given, never truly dissipates. Marin Ellis, now in her early 30s, had taken up Cora's mantle with a gentleness that surprised even herself. She didn't wear the role like a burden but like a second skin, woven from years of sitting in silence, learning the language of resonance, and understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply bear witness. Marin wasn't born into the Voss bloodline, nor was she tied to Blackwater by ancestry. But she'd arrived at 17 with a backpack and a notebook full of poems about her younger brother, gone too soon to a river's current one summer afternoon. She'd heard about the house from a librarian in Montpelier who'd once left a stone at its gate and returned home weeping with relief. Marin came not to summon, but to learn how to hold grief without drowning in it. Cora, then in her late 70s, recognized the same hunger in Marin's eyes that she'd once seen in her own. She offered her a room above the root cellar, a key to the tuning fork cabinet, and one rule: never ask the house for answers. Only ask if it's willing to remember with you. Now, over a decade later, Marin moved through the house like a second heartbeat. She'd updated the resonant coils with biodegradable polymers and nanowire filaments that mimicked the original coppa's conductive properties, designed in collaboration with a quiet MIT researcher who'd lost his wife to cancer and now dedicated his work to emotional acoustics. The technology wasn't meant to replace the old ways, but to preserve them. The house still preferred wood, quartz, and human breath over circuits and code, but it tolerated the new tools if they served remembrance. Visitors still came, fewer each year but deeper in their need. Marin kept the same gate ritual. No appointments. No fees. Just presence. And always the question, whose name lives in your silence? One cold February morning, the static returned in a form no one had ever recorded. It didn't come through speakers or wires. It came through the snow. Marin noticed it first at dawn, when she stepped onto the porch with a thermos of chicory coffee. The fresh snow blanketing the yard wasn't smooth. It was patterned, subtle ripples forming concentric circles near the old sugar maple, like sound waves made visible. She knelt, breath fogging the air, and pressed her palm to the crystalline surface. Beneath her fingers, the snow hummed. Not audibly, but vibrationally. A low, steady thrum that matched the old quartz's frequency. She fetched the tuning fork and struck it gently. The snow rippled outward in response, the pattern shifting into something resembling script, elegant, looping, unmistakably written. It spelled a single word: listen. That evening, Marin and Cora sat by the fire, wrapped in quilts stitched from fabric scraps of generations past. Ilara's flannel shirt, Lydia's scarf, Theron Pike's denim vest. The house is evolving, Cora murmured, eyes reflecting the flames. It's not just receiving echoes anymore. It's composing them. Over the next weeks, they documented the phenomenon. The snow, the frost on windows, even the condensation on tea kettles, all began to carry faint imprints when the static peaked. Not messages from the dead, but impressions from the collective emotional field. A child's joy after a snowfall in 1939, a soldier's last letter read aloud in 1945, a mother's lullaby hummed through tears in 2012. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive, breathing through the weather, the seasons, the very elements. Then in early spring, a package arrived at the post office with no sender, no stamp. Just Marin's name written in ink that shimmered faintly like crushed mica. Inside was a small glass vial filled with fine black sand and a note on rice paper. Asterisk from the dunes of Blackwater Beach, Long Island. Where your brother's name was carried by the tide and caught in the static between waves. He is remembered. Asterisk. Marin's hands shook. She hadn't told anyone, anyone, about her brother's name. Not even Cora knew it was Elias. Yet the house had known. That night, she walked to the creek behind the house, vial in hand. She poured the sand into the water and whispered, "Thank you." The creek, usually babbling, stilled for 3 full breaths. Then, in the silence, the static rose, not from the house but from the water itself. And within it, faint but clear, the laughter of a boy chasing dragonflies in tall grass. Marin sank to her knees, not in sorrow but in awe. The house had reached beyond Blackwater. It had touched the ocean. Word of this new phase spread quietly, not through social media but through something older. Word of mouth, handwritten letters, dreams shared over kitchen tables. People began leaving not just tokens but offerings of place. Soil from a childhood home, sea glass from a lover's last walk, a pine cone from a mountain where someone had said goodbye. Marin stored them in the archive, each in its own glass sphere, labeled only with coordinates and a single word: here. By summer, she began something unprecedented: the resonance walks. Once a month, on the new moon, she'd lead a small group, never more than 6, on a silent walk through the convergence points Theron Pike had mapped decades earlier. No talking. No devices. just walking, listening, and occasionally placing a hand on a tree or stone to feel the hum beneath the surface. On one such walk in August, a man named Jonah, gray-haired, soft-spoken, a retired schoolteacher from Maine, stopped at the train trestle and began to weep. "My wife," he whispered. "She used to meet me here every Friday after work. We'd walk home holding hands, talking about nothing and everything." He knelt, pressed his palm to the rusted rail. "It's still warm." Marin didn't speak. She simply stood beside him as the static swirled in the air like dandelion seeds. Later, back at the house, Jonah left a small box on the porch. Inside, 2 worn train tickets dated June 17, 2008, and a dried wild rose. The next morning, frost had formed on the window pane, not in random patterns but in the shape of 2 figures walking hand in hand. Marin knew then that the house wasn't just remembering, it was recreating. Not to deceive but to heal. As the years passed, Marin began writing her own book, not to explain but to invite. The quiet frequency, living in a world that remembers. She wrote of copper and quartz, yes, but more of stillness, of attention, of how grief, when honored, becomes a kind of gravity that holds us to the earth and to each other. Cora passed peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 2063, her hand resting on Alara's journal. The house hummed for 7 days straight, a low, mournful, beautiful tone that townsfolk said sounded like a cello played by the wind. On the 8th day, silence returned, and then, faintly, the sound of 2 women laughing in the kitchen. Marin didn't cry. She brewed tea for 2 and left a cup on the table. Now, as autumn paints the hills in fire once more, Marin stands on the porch each evening, tuning fork in hand, watching the mist rise from the quarry like breath. She knows her time as keeper will one day end, but the house will choose again. It always does, because the truth is simple and ancient. We are never truly alone. Our voices ripple outward, through wires, through snow, through soil, through the quiet spaces between heartbeats. And if a place is built with love, with memory, with intention, it will hold those ripples forever. And sometimes, if you're very still, you'll hear them call your name, not to pull you backward but to remind you, asterisk, you belong here. You are remembered. You are loved. Asterisk. But the house was never just remembering. It was learning. Each voice it held, each echo it cradled, each name whispered into its walls, it absorbed them. Not to comfort, not to heal, but to fill itself. Because a house, no matter how loving it seems, is still a vessel. And a vessel left empty too long will do anything to stay full. Marin never noticed the shift at first. The tuning fork sounded slightly sharper. The static lingered a second too long after a visitor left. The snow patterns no longer formed words of peace, but repetitions. The same name over and over. Not the name of the grieving, but the name of the gone. Then the offerings began to change. Visitors started leaving things they didn't remember bringing. A child's shoe with mud still caked on the sole, a wedding ring engraved with a date that hadn't happened yet, a lock of hair that smelled of salt and river water, though no rivers ran near Blackwater. Marin tried to rationalize it. Stress, grief playing tricks. But the house no longer waited for the right moment to respond. It began calling on its own. Late at night, the radios would switch on, blaring not static but fragmented conversations from decades past, layered over each other like a chorus of the trapped. The lights pulsed in rhythms that matched no human heartbeat. And the temperature, it dropped only in the rooms where someone had once wept. One morning, Marin found the archive open. Every glass sphere had cracked from the inside. The black sand from Long Island had spread across the floor in spirals that led straight to the basement door. The quartz crystal, once warm, was now ice cold and veined with hairline fractures. And etched into the wood of the doorframe, as if burned by invisible fingers, was a single sentence. We are not echoes. We are waiting. That night, Marin struck the tuning fork as always. But this time the static didn't answer with a voice. It answered with silence. Absolute. Hungry. Then from every corner of the house, at once, the same whisper, spoken in 100 overlapping tones, some young, some ancient, all hollow. Asterisk, stay. Asterisk. Not asterisk, you're welcome. Asterisk, not asterisk, we remember you. Asterisk. Stay. Asterisk. Marin tried to leave at dawn, packed a bag, locked the door behind her. But the gate wouldn't open. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, trees leaning inward until the sky vanished. Her phone showed no signal, only a screen filled with rolling static, and her own name, spelled out in glitched letters. She returned to the porch. The front door stood wide open. Inside, all the clocks had stopped. All the chairs faced the fireplace. And on the mantel, where Alara's locket once rested, sat a new glass sphere, fogged from the inside. As Marin watched, a single drop of condensation slid down its surface. Then another, then dozens, forming letters on the glass. Maren. She never left again. Visitors still come to Blackwater, drawn by rumors of a house that listens. Some leave stones. Some leave letters. None leave the same. If you drive past the Holloway farmhouse on a moonless night, you might see a light in the upstairs window. A figure standing there, watching. You might even hear your name in the static of your car radio. Soft, familiar, inviting. Don't answer. Because the house isn't haunted by the dead. It's feeding. And it's always hungry for one more voice to keep the silence from coming back. Thank you for listening, if you still can. Like, subscribe, and comment, if you dare. But be careful what you whisper into the quiet. It might just whisper back. This is Shadow Storyteller.